Don't know what to do with the ashes of a loved one or beloved pet? In this video, I'll be showing you a variety of cremation urns that you can 3D print that will serve as a fitting and respectful tribute for the ashes of the deceased. Don't adjust your internet feed. Printable Science presents 3D printed cremation urns.
This video has been made possible by the generosity of our patrons and viewers like you.
A few years ago, when one of the family dogs died, I was very much into woodworking. And the important thing I neglected to appreciate about woodworking is that it's a money pit, particularly and perhaps exclusively if you're as untalented as I am. You buy a table saw and you think you'll make a small box, and then you have to wrestle with the reality that you can't even cut lumber in a straight line. Do you respond reasonably and move on to some other hobby like scrapbooking or stamp collecting? No, because the store and the catalogs know most hobbyist woodworkers can't cut a straight line and are filled with gizmos and gadgets that promise to help you cut a straight line, and those gizmos and gadgets aren't cheap. So although I eventually managed to produce a cremation casket that I was more or less satisfied with, it, in fact, here it is. Here it is right here. It took more lumber than it would take to build a house, and I spent more money on tools and equipment than the GNP of a third world country. So my interest in woodworking began to fade, and not only due to the waste and expense, but also because in my advancing years I was no longer as alert as I used to be, and being around spinning things and sharp objects was just becoming unsafe. Just how unsafe was revealed when I managed to take off the tip of my finger with the table saw, and as my wife drove madly around trying to remember which of the two hospitals closest to us but in opposite directions was in network. I was writhing around almost unconscious with blood gushing from my hand, and I'm pretty sure I came to a Jesus moment with a promise to God that if I was allowed to live, I promised I would never use a power tool again. Oh, and if you don't know what in-network means, then you don't live in the United States, and you should be grateful, at least when it comes to healthcare. So after things had mostly healed, I sat about wondering how I could put my creative urges to work and stumbled upon 3D printing. It seemed kind of compelling, and I figured the worst thing I could do was maybe burn my finger. So feeling I had little to use, I bought one of the early 3D printers and began exploring what one might reasonably hope to accomplish with it. It was a bit of a rough go, as early pioneers in 3D printing will tell you. The printers were pretty expensive, not very reliable, and not very accurate, and the larger problem was that it was not easy to translate a design in your head to a finished object on your print bed. It was in that context that another dog died, and although problematic, I thought I would set about to design and print an urn for favored puppy number 2. As my original container would be described as a cremation casket, I thought it would be neat to fashion a traditional urn. Just making another casket would be simply duplicating what I had done in wood for the first project, and the ability to easily incorporate more organic shapes into my design was another good thing about 3D printing. Granted, I could have turned one out on a lathe, but even in the full flush of woodworking, I never had a lathe. But with my 3D printer, I had the design freedom to make a casket or an urn or whatever shape I wanted without having to buy a whole new inventory of equipment. So I set about to model an urn of appropriate size, but it was a bit of a torturous experience because I'm just not the artist I wish I was. I adopted a modeling program called OpenSCAD because first, it was free, and secondly, because it's very useful to linear thinkers, straight lines, things you can draw with a compass or a ruler. And also because it has, at least compared to other options that were available at the time, a gentler learning curve. Programs like MeshLab and Blender, you can do incredible stuff with, but they're not easy to use, and I know I'd struggle to create even the simplest shape, and that I would only be taunted and tortured by features I would never accomplish or master. It turned out to be relatively painless to design the urn I wanted using Inkscape and OpenSCAD, but I'll save you the boring details, unless, of course, I get lots of comments saying, oh, please tell us all the boring details, in which case I can put together a step-by-step video of how I did what I did. Now, once the basic urn shape had been determined, then the most important consideration is how large it needs to be. Net research reveals that as a rule of thumb, every pound or half kilogram of an animal, that includes you and me, translates into roughly 1 cubic inch or 16.5 cubic centimeters of ash. Now, they clarify that this translation is not particularly accurate, and that height is actually a better indication of ash yield because it's bone that ash is mainly composed of, not fat and muscle. But the sources I checked out all seem to suggest that something around 200 cubic inches will accommodate the ashes of an adult male. Armed with this calculation, we can also set about to create urns of appropriate sizes for different uses, like containers for pet ashes and the like. I've included files for urns of different volumes that should handle, goldfish, rabbits, cats, and all but the largest dogs. If you're one of our patrons, you can also order up an urn of whatever volume you require, and this really is the way to go rather than scaling one of the existing files up or down, as that may well produce urns with walls that just waste filament by being too thick, or urns that fall apart on the print bed because the walls are too thin. So here we have a 5-ounce urn for goldfish and hamsters and the like, a 15-ounce size for your standard house cat, and a 25-ounce urn for your average large-sized dog, or maybe it's this one. There we go. And a large 180-ounce one for a human being. Now, all these urns were printed with PLA with a 0.2 millimeter layer height, 2 perimeters, 4 bottom layers, and 5 top layers. It was interesting to discover that the curve of the urn, while not even close to what one would assume is close to overhang height, my 3D printers actually had some difficulty with. To help things out, I selected avoid crossing perimeters and choosing a random seam position as options in the slicer. The thicker the wall one uses, the better the result, but then you have the trade-off between smoothness of finish and print time. For the models I've included here, I've tried to strike a balance between the two. I also selected marble as the filament of choice, as it seems to be the most forgiving in terms of surface texture, at least from a visual point of view. Once printed, there's a simple assembly for each urn, which just involves screwing the thread of the cap into the cap. You'll want to test that first, and then add just a daub of glue before screwing it on tight and giving the glue a chance to dry. Custom engraving of urns is a natural for 3D printed objects, and as example, here's the goldfish-sized one for Nemo, and a cat-sized one for Garfield. If you're one of our patrons, you can order up an urn of the size and engraving you desire. Even if you don't want to engrave an urn, you can always dress it up a bit with something like a filament change during printing, as in this example where the top rim of this black urn is finished off with some silver silk PLA. So there you have it, your own 3D printed cremation urns that will garner the respect of your friends, the unceasing loyalty of your loved ones, and nominate you for the next year's Most Helpful Person in the Pandemic Award. Check out the video description for the link to download the SD files you need for this project. And I hope that one of these urns will allow you to provide your family or friends, or perhaps just someone in need, with a fitting memorial for the ashes of a departed loved one, or comfort a bereaved pet owner with a fitting memorial of a faithful companion. Thanks for watching. And if you'd like to see all of the neat projects we have coming up, then make sure you keep in touch, and you should know how to make that happen. As always, we also invite you to visit our website at printablescience.com, where all the science that fits, we print.